Now, when you make your jelly roll quilt, you might want to make it be bigger than the normal jelly roll quilt, which would be 50 inches wide by 64 inches long if you used 40 strips. Your 40 strips would, when you sewed them together, would equal about 1,600 inches long, and by the time you sewed it down to your 32 rows, which all jelly roll race quilts end up having 32 rows, you would end up with a quilt that was 50 inches wide by 64 inches wide. So the way you figure it out is if you put in 50 inches wide here times 32, you would get the number 1,600, and then you divide by 41, and then it would tell you how many strips you needed, which would be about 40. So say you want to make it bigger. And I've made some queen quilts, and I've made my queen quilts bigger. I used 75 inches as my width because I added borders to the side of my quilts, and I don't have my quilts go all the way to the floor. I just have them cover the mattress, the top mattress, and then I have a bed skirt on the box spring. I also don't use the length of the quilt to cover my pillows because I use pillowcases and pillow shams instead of having a longer quilt. So basically my quilts end up being 75 inches by about 84 inches, and then I'll add approximately 6 to 8 inches on all the sides in borders, and so I'll end up with a quilt that's about 92 by 96. So let's just show the math right now. Say we want to have a quilt that's 75 inches wide, so I'm going to write the number 75 here, and then I'm going to multiply that by 32, and if I do that, I come out with the number 2,400. Now, a regular jelly roll race quilt will be 1,600 inches long after you add all of the sew all of the rows together. So 75 times 32 is going to give me 2,400. So that means I have to start out with a piece of a strip of fabric sewed together that's 2,400 inches long. Usually I don't measure this. Usually I count how many strips I need and I put them on there, and it ends up more or less 75 inches wide. Okay? Then you're going to divide this number by 41 inches, which is, if you have a 42 inch length or a 44 inch length of each strip, that's pretty close to the number you're going to come up with after you've done your seams. So if I say 2,400 divided by 45, then I'm going to come up with the number, I'm doing it on my calculator because I'm not that great. I'm going to come up with the number of 58. Okay? And it actually is 58.5, so I would round that up, and I'd say 59. So I probably would round it up even a little bit more and say I'm going to use 60 strips to make my quilt about 75 inches wide. You can always take off, and you may have to do a little bit of squaring up when you're finished with it to make sure that it is square, and so it's always good to kind of err on the side of making it a little bit wider than it would be to make it a little bit too narrow. The one thing about jelly roll race quilts is The number of strips that you start with determines the width. The length is always going to be the same. The length is always going to be 62 inches long, 64 inches long, because you are always going to have 32 rows, and the strips are going to end up 2 inches wide after you've sewn 1/4 of an inch on either side of your 2.5 inch strip. So 32 times 2 is 64. So that usually is not long enough for your bed quilt. So you're going to have to add some rows to the bottom once you're finished. You'll have, if you start out with 60, you're going to have a piece that's going to end up being 75 inches wide and 64 inches long. So that didn't work for me, so this is what I had to do. I had to add some rows at the end of my quilt when I was all finished making the regular Jelly Roll Race quilt. And basically what I had to do is I had to figure out how many more rows I wanted to add to get it to be the length that I wanted. So I went to 84 inches long, so then I had to add 20 inches. Okay, so 20 times 2, I wrote the wrong number here. I had to add 10 rows. So now I have to figure out some math here. So 10 rows times the width. So 10 times 75 inches equals the number 750. And now I'm going to divide that number by 41 to tell me how many more strips I'm going to have to add. And it came out to about a little bit over 18. So probably I would add the 2 more extra rows that I had. If I bought 2 jelly rolls, I would have 80 strips altogether. I'm going to use 60 strips in my regular jelly roll, and I'm going to add 18 to 20 to my additional rows. What you have to do is you need to sew these on one strip at a time. You can't sew it together the way you had sewed the original Jelly Roll quilt. I will caution you that when you're doing this, you have to watch out that you don't end up sewing every row from left to right, or you're going to end up with your fabric bowing out. And so the best thing is, so the first one this direction, and then go from here. You can either flip it over, but do the second one from this direction, and then do the third one from this direction. Or what I did with some of mine is I sewed a couple of them onto the bottom, and then I sewed a couple of them onto the top. Keep reversing the direction, because then that way you're going to end up with it being pretty flat and pretty straight. The one that I made where I added the 10 rows all at the same time and all from the same direction, my fabric bowed out, and I couldn't lay it flat. It had like a pregnant belly that was right in the middle of it, and I couldn't figure out what happened. I had to take all of that off, and I had to re-sew it. The other thing that you can do is, if you're going to do this and you want it exactly 75 inches wide, then go ahead and cut your pieces exactly 75 inches wide and add them, easing them in so that they are fitting in perfectly as you're going along. So that's the way to make your Jelly Roll quilt bigger. I'll show you again the formula for how you're going to figure it out. You take your inches wide times 32, divide by 41, and that tells you how many strips you need. And if you do that, then you're able to make it any size that you want.